Okay, just started the recording. Today I'm going to talk about DS interviews. On this doc, I've sort of categorized it into four different kinds of interviews. This is based off of my experience personally, based off my former classmates' experience, former students' experience, and just like people who I've met. I hear a lot about interview processes a lot of times through my students, and this is just information that I've put together. Um, and I will say that every company has a different process. It really depends on like size of company, how they work with their HR, who's doing the recruiting, who's doing the hiring. So it does differ a bit, but most of the interviews will fall into one or multiple of these categories. So to start, disclaimer, this is not like how every interview is like, it's just based off of experiences that I've gathered. But the first round interview. Now, the first round interview, I like to call like a screener or an introductory interview. And a lot of times it's like over the phone, if anything, a very, very quick Zoom call to just get a sense of who you are. I would say this is probably like maybe someone reaches out to you on LinkedIn and then you reach out to someone else on LinkedIn and you have like, a first round get to know you kind of call. It will not be very, very technical, although might be conceptually technical. And I'll go down bullet point by bullet point, so it's in order. But overall, things to prepare. Do research the company and the role. If it's a specific role that you had applied for, and they got back to you via that specific role, look at that job description. It's important that you look at the job description. So as you are, talking about yourself, you will cater your answers to what the job description is asking for. I mean, it sounds like common sense, but even myself, sometimes I forget to do that, especially when you're in the troves of like a lot of job applications at the same time. At least have that job description up on your screen at some point so you can refer to it and then look at the points. Maybe they're like, okay, more about analytics. Okay, talk about your analytics experience. More about like creating pipelines, talk about that. So very, very important. At least have the job description up or have some notes written down about the job description, just so it's like very front of mind what you're going to talk about. If it's a company with a lot of information online, research the company, get a sense of what their culture is like. If any of their like higher ups have social media, that's usually a thing that people like to talk about. If there's anything recent happening with the company, bring it up just to show that you're actually genuinely interested in the company. Also, during those interviews, and pretty much during every interview, someone's going to ask you if you have any questions for them. It is just like an interview no-no, like to never say, nope, I've got no questions for you. So always try to think of meaningful questions. For a more slightly technical role, I kind of like to ask like, what kind of problems is your company or this team specifically, again, depending on the size, what kind of problems are you looking for this role to solve? That's a question that I like to ask a lot, especially if it's not immediately clear through their job description. Another question I personally have liked to ask in the past is, what drew you to this company? Or what about this company excites you? Something along those lines, especially if it's like a less technical person who is interviewing you. For this first round, it does differ. It could be like an HR person who is just calling you to get a sense of like, your kind of cultural fit, or it could be someone on the team that is looking to hire. So if you can, I know not all the time this is possible, if you can, look up the person who you're going to be speaking to so you can find out whether it's an HR person who, usually if it's an HR person, they would be listening out for just like keywords, but you will be asked to dive deep into what those mean. So maybe they ask you about a project, you can talk about the fact that you train some machine learning models, but you don't have to go into much more detail than that. If you see that it's someone on that team that has maybe like some engineering experience or like some analytics experience, be prepared to answer some more like conceptual questions. Usually the first round, you wouldn't be asked to do anything more than speak about things. You very likely won't be asked to code anything on the spot. So the main thing with these interviews is to try and align yourself with the company culture as much as you can. If you these things can be very, very subtle, but the whole idea is to get them to want to work with you. Honestly, that's very, very like brief, like very, very simplistically what you want to get them to do, what you want to convey during this very first interview. So yeah, especially for smaller companies, you can find out a lot about tone culture via their website or social media. The most common question that you will get asked in this kind of very first interview is tell me about yourself. If throughout like your multiple interviews, you're interviewing with different people, everyone is going to ask you to tell you about themselves. So I would say even like write it on a document or in a notes app somewhere, literally come up with bullet points of things that you want to say. I found this very, very helpful for myself. Even if it's like, you know, non-technical interviews or pretty much any interview, I will have a document of all of the notes I've made for myself to remember like what to say. You don't want to go on too many tangents if you're like, I've found myself in situations where I go like, where I drone on and on about things that are not relevant just because I'm like on a, I don't know, some days your brain isn't working the right way. So very, very important to have, it really does help me, especially to have your points written down, especially now that everything's on Zoom. You can have like your Zoom on one side of the screen, your notes on another side. No one's gonna know, no one's gonna care. So do that to prepare yourself. As I mentioned earlier, prepare to study for more conceptual questions that people can ask to just test their knowledge. Even if it's an HR person, I've had interviews where I like answer a question. They're like, okay, good. You said the words that we were listening out for, like random forest, like bias, various trade-off, things like that. And so in terms of conceptual questions, this is something that I put together for all of my cohorts, and it is linked within here. So feel free to look at these. These are some of the more common conceptual questions that I've collected from myself and students over the past year and a half, pretty much. So these are questions that you can feel free to look at. Maybe you want to even like take this document, copy them, prepare your answers. That could be something you do as well. Not going to go through all of this right now, but these are more like they'll ask you over the phone and just listen out for some keywords. Another very, very common question is tell me about one of your projects or something that you're working on. I would say that like prepare more than one story that showcases your abilities. Either it's something that's technical or something that highlights yourself to be a worthwhile team member. I know Amber mentioned that she had you guys pair up to work on some projects. If you have any experiences on collaboration, because very likely the job that you're interviewing for is part of a team. If you can speak to any experiences of yourself working as a team that was very efficient and effective, maybe in like your communication tactics, maybe the way that you keep each other accountable, try and mention that, weave that into your story. I think for things like this, they're very likely going to draw from your resume. So whatever projects you choose to put on your resume, and I'll actually talk about resumes at next week's study group, but whatever projects you decide to put on your resume, whatever technical phrases, models, algorithms, words you decide to put on your resume, be prepared to answer conceptual questions about that. Again, this is also something that I always have a doc of like bullet points to talk of like things to talk about, just so you're prepared. Because very oftentimes if someone just straight up asks you, okay, well, tell me about your capstone project, you want to be able to talk about it at different levels. So again, really depending on who is the person interviewing at the time, maybe like a 1 minute summary of your whole project process, non-technical, that's fine. Maybe it's someone who's slightly more technical. You want to get into, you know, your thoughts when you were choosing your model or your thoughts when you were gathering your data. Again, also you want to relate it to the role as much as possible. So yeah, I honestly have like a 2-page document of all the things I could possibly say during an interview that I like, depending on who I'm talking to, pick and choose the points to mention. So that's the first kind of interview. Sounds like a lot, but usually it's like a 15 to 30-minute call. Most of the ones that I've had and students have had of this sort are like over the phone, like they will call your phone, or a very, very quick Zoom call. All right. The next kind is a coding or a problem-solving technical interview in either Python or SQL. This, I've noticed that during COVID has become less and less prevalent. Yeah, less and less prevalent because I think this is for some companies just very labor intensive. And how it works is basically you'll get on a call with another engineer of some sort, basically someone who codes, and they'll present you with some problems and you'll have to live code the solution right in front of them. I've done this maybe like 10 or so times. Very, very nerve-wracking because they are just going to tell you a problem. They give you test cases on the spot and you have to make it work. And you have to explain what you're doing while you're doing it. And that is very, very stressful. It's one thing to like be able to sit there silently and work on the code. It's another thing to every time you type something, someone's asking you, oh, why do you decide to do that? Why do you decide to do that? So it's very, very stressful. I would say practice on HackerRank or LeetCode. I would say LeetCode is more for software engineers. Another one that is good is Code Wars. Code Wars is another website that has a good amount of like these challenges. They're not very data sciencey, but it's more of like, can you solve problems with code for the Python ones? And for SQL, sometimes they'll like throw you like a few SQL query questions. The SQL ones are typically a little simpler. I would say the hardest thing I've ever been asked is something with like a subquery. So yeah, the one I talked about is like live coding or pair programming, and you just have to explain your processes. I will tell you, out of like the 10 or so interviews of this kind that I've done, I have never been able to solve a question that they've posed to me because that's the kind of question that they ask. They ask the kind of question where is that kind of question of like, if you had like a bunch of different schedules and a bunch of different rooms, what's the best way to optimize? It's the kind of thing where it's not so much like this is the answer, rather they want to test how you break down the problem. So I think there's maybe like one that they asked me to like do something very, very simple, like construct a dictionary, like blah, blah, blah. Those kinds of questions, fine. But a lot of times it's more of those like, if you like Google software engineering questions, and you'll see a whole list of the kind of questions I'm talking about. Like you're probably not going to solve it on the spot in like an hour. So yeah. In these cases, remembering syntax is not very important. A lot of times, every single interview of this kind that I've had, they've let me Google things on the side or just ask the person like, oh, do you remember the syntax for like a dot map, for example? And they've just told me straight up. And I don't think that that's a problem. It's more so to judge your problem solving processes. So one tip that I've gotten from like other software engineers who like solely do this kind of interviews is to break down the problem as much as you can. A lot of times these problems have a lot of different variables. Break it down and document what you're doing in comments. So a lot of times it'll be sort of like on an IDE, on like a little like coding. They have like this technology, or there's like a platform that allows you to have two people code like on a Google Doc. So they have done it like that, and just add your comments as much as possible, just so you show that you understand what they're asking for. Yeah, so break up your problems to smaller problems. Another just like small tip is whenever you need to store data to look up in the future at like maybe a different point of your problem, store it in a dictionary whenever possible. This is a tip that I actually got from a lot of software engineers, is that because looping through a list and looking up for specific values is very, very inefficient. If you can store it in some sort of key value pair, that is much more efficient. Or even as a set, if you're storing something as a set, if the order doesn't matter, especially, way, way more efficient to store data and look up data. So that's one kind of way to do like a problem solving technical interview. Another kind that's pretty common as well, this one is I think getting more and more common during COVID times, is a time test URL. And so what this looks like is they will literally email you a link. No one is proctoring, you're doing this in front of no one else, but it's like a link and there's like a time limit. It really depends on the company. I think they get to decide how much time that they want to allocate. And you solve a couple questions within a time limit. Most times I've actually been given links off of HackerRank. And I think for companies, they are on HackerRank, I think there's a capability for them to like pick and choose questions to give as a test. And so that's why I think that HackerRank is a really good platform to practice off of, because if you do enough questions on HackerRank, you might encounter them during an interview. So there was one time that I got like, I think I got like 6 questions on one of these tests. I had 2 hours to do it. 4 Python questions, 2 SQL questions. 2 of the Python questions I had seen before. So it was a lot easier for me to get through. One of the SQL I had seen before as well. So just doing a bunch of HackerRank questions, I think has that benefit that you might just encounter it during these kinds of interviews. So yeah, these ones, it's stressful, less stressful in different ways. It is timed and like, that's just stressful, I guess, the fact that it's timed, but no one's watching you and you don't have to like live code in front of people. So that's good. I will say that there was one of these that they told me I could not Google, but just one. And I think that's something that they can control through HackerRank. I'm not too sure. But yeah, that's one kind of interview. Overall, this kind of interview is getting less and less common versus a take-home interview. Especially my recent students who graduated during the time of COVID, they've seen a lot of take-home interviews. But any questions about any of the things I've mentioned so far? All right. Okay. So take-home interviews are the kinds that I've seen get more and more common. It's basically like doing a mini project, which I think is really interesting. And there's a lot of room for you to share your expertise and your knowledge within these kinds of interviews. So a lot of times you're given some sort of case study. It can either be maybe something that literally the team is working on. Maybe it's something that's just very, very similar and they already have a solution, but they want to see how you solve it. I've also seen the kind where it's like, I've actually done an interview like this for a startup once where they were actually still thinking about what they wanted to do. Therefore, they gave this question as an interview question just to see how like potential employees would solve it, I guess. So you're given a case study. You're basically presented with some sort of business problem. And the idea is to use whatever data science tools you have in your toolkit to best tackle this problem. So I've seen this done in several ways. I've been given like just PDFs of like a prompt and they're like, oh, prepare a presentation. Prepare a presentation and just present it to us. Make sure it's like 10 minutes long, hit these points. I want to see these solutions. And sometimes they'll give you like a little bit of like dummy data, and they'll sometimes tell you specifically what libraries they want you to use. I've seen ones that are like, they actually give you a Jupyter notebook and the data files, and they're like, oh, do this analysis. We want to find any insight that we can about like, I don't know, the way that customers use our platform, something like that. I will say that the most recent ones I've seen someone actually been asked to code a recommendation engine. That one specifically is because it's for a recommendation system position and team. I've also seen someone asked to conduct an A/B testing project, actually exactly the same as our A/B testing lab, just different data set, but pretty much the same thing as our A/B testing lab that we had in our curriculum back in phase 2. Also, I've seen a bunch where it's like, this is my business problem, do a presentation. So it really depends. It may or may not be coded, might be pseudo coded. The ones that I actually really like is like action plans where they don't even give you data, but like you have a lot of freedom to tell them. They will give you some constraints, but you get to like explore, use your business sense a little bit and talk about, okay, well, ideally we get this data. We can do this kind of analysis and then we can get these results, hopefully. I think those are a lot of fun because you just don't have to code as much, I guess. But yeah, for these kinds of interviews, I think what's really interesting is you can think about caveats and edge cases to account for. A lot of times these businesses, and not these businesses, these business cases, they work for general, like I guess the general population, but if you try and think of like, okay, cases where your analysis might not work as well, or cases where your analysis you might need to like take it with a grain of salt in certain circumstances, for example. Like maybe this company is based in like New York, but then if you think about like, maybe if the company wants to expand to like other countries, or if you see that this company has branches in like other states or something, maybe the data will be different. It really depends. Here, I would say try and balance solving the problem and also showing your understanding of what the company is doing. Because it's a balance of these two that will, I think, make a very like well-rounded presentation. But but yeah, this one can really happen in a bunch of different ways. But they've all been really interesting. If anything, each one of these interviews you get is like a real learning experience, because oftentimes you'll be asked to walk through your findings or your process with someone else on the team. And especially if it's like a project that they've already implemented or done in the past, you can learn a lot about like the way that, a company is working on stuff. So I've personally really enjoyed these, even for the jobs that I didn't get. And yeah, at some point, even especially those like coded ones, I've seen some that are eerily similar to completing like a phase project. The final kind of interview, this Q&A style technical interview, this is more of like when you're at like the final stages, I think. These will very likely be with people that you'll be working with. I would say that to prepare for these, ask in prior interviews about the technologies and libraries that they use. If you get to this point of a company's interview process, a lot of the skills that they might list on their job description that hadn't come up before, like maybe something with like, maybe like an AWS thing, or like a specific kind of database that they use, or maybe they use like a cloud platform that I think you should really start to familiarize yourself with that if you get to this like late stage interview. So really try and ask, go back to the job description, figure out what kind of technologies they use, because this might come back. This kind of interview, it can really differ, because at this stage is pretty much the people of the team that role is being hired for. They want to gauge how useful you will be for them. So this is like the most like wild card kind of interview. I've been in a few of these situations where I've literally been given like, this is our data right now. This is what we're looking to do. How would you solve our problem? So kind of similar to that, but more like in person, I guess, because they want to see how they can interact with you on a daily basis. And at this stage, usually because this will be like with your future team, they will ask about your projects in much more detail. They will really test your technical understanding of material. So if it's an analytics role, sure, you might not have to go into like the details about like your model and like your neural networks. If you do that, you probably won't be asked that. Really depends on the role itself. So just think about that role specifically. What technologies would you be using? Focus your efforts on that. Yeah. Questions about that, as I think of like what other things would be useful to think about. All right, well, just remember in all of these interviews and at any stage of interview, especially if it's a different person each time, they're going to ask you if you have questions for them. And I feel like that, to me at least, has been the hardest part, just coming up with questions to ask people at companies. I think it's also like you have to balance showing that you've researched and also showing that you're curious enough to like not know certain things. So at each stage, I like to kind of like remember which questions that I've asked several people on that team, and then just, throw them whatever questions that I hadn't asked yet. I think overall, they do care a little bit less about, do you know this specific thing versus are you able to quickly learn this specific thing? I think that's one thing that bootcamp grads really do have an advantage over a traditional college grad. The fact that you were able to, in this short amount of time, learn material that people honestly will take years and years to figure out. And the fact that you can quickly get to an implementation phase of something. Yes, bootcamp grads, some people might say like lack the like depth of understanding, but at the end of the day, like if you can get it to work for a lot of companies that they know what they're getting into with bootcamp students, and you really want to show that you can quickly learn and adapt to whatever the technologies they are using. Yeah, I think that's all I had here. Conceptual questions, I have grouped into like statistics. The statistics part, it really depends. If they say on their job description, MS in math or statistics or whatever, as a bootcamp grad, you should not be afraid to apply to those roles. But be prepared to answer more of the math stats questions like these, like what is the probability density function? What's the central limit theorem? Like there are all these like Bayes theorem kind of questions as well. And then these are like linear models. If specifically, and this has appeared on some job descriptions I've seen in the past, if they talk about doing regression, be prepared to talk about regression, especially like even if it's not on your resume, because that will likely be your job. With linear regression, a lot of the times the questions are about interpreting the results that you get. It's not so much about, oh, how does the model figure out what the best coefficients are? It's more about how you interpret them and whether you are able to think critically about the results that you're getting and how like the model will be used in real life. So the whole idea of like model fit versus model predictability, those kinds of questions. And then with machine learning, I would say that if it's on your resume, do prepare like a 2 to 3 sentence summary explaining each of the models that you talk about on your resume, just in case. But these are also some of the more like common machine learning questions, like bias variance trade-off. That's basically overfitting versus underfitting. Regularization, overfitting. Explaining the process of gradient descent. Now that one is a tough one. I have been asked that a few times. Being able to explain it at different levels, I've found it has been helpful. This is one of the things that I actually have like bullet points on a document on the screen when they ask this question. Precision recall accuracy. This oftentimes is asked in the context of your project. I'll talk more about resumes next week, but if on your resume you say that, oh, you trained for like, you optimize for recall, they'll ask you, why you decide to do recall over accuracy? So be prepared to talk about that kind of stuff as well. These are project questions that have been asked. These are, I think, the most commonly asked project questions. So yeah, feel free to like prepare what you want to say about your projects, maybe based on these questions as well. But yeah, that's kind of all of my like gathered data so far on interviews. These docs are linked together. Again, at the end of next week, I'll send you all like a Google Drive folder with all of my resources so that you can, peruse as you please. But yeah, any thoughts or questions on any of this stuff? Sweet. Well, I know that interviewing is still a little bit away. So I would say that, and also like with career coaching, you get to declare like a job search start date. So I do highly recommend that some of you like take a break if you can from data science for like at least a couple weeks because the burnout is super, super real. And also once you start career coaching, you're going to have like a bunch of requirements to hit on a weekly basis. So give yourself that like break to recharge as you prepare for those stages. So yeah, thoughts, questions. Now let me turn off the recording.